16 months. I was a platform operations manager, and the responsibilities that I had were over policy compliance for Facebook apps and data protection, so protecting the data of users who use Facebook apps. Those are my primary responsibilities.
Yeah. There's been considerable interest in the last few days in particular, but it was also of interest to the committee when we took evidence from Facebook at our hearing in Washington last month over the safeguards in place that protect Facebook users' data. And perhaps you could explain a little bit to us about the way those safeguards worked when you were at Facebook.
Yeah, so perhaps I can start by giving a brief description of how Facebook platform, which is what apps use, works, because that will, I think, be helpful in understanding some of what follows. So when you connect to an app, you being a user of Facebook, and that app is connected to Facebook, and there were a number of categories of these apps, including game, surveys, and various other types. Facebook asks you, the user, for permission to give the developer, the person who made the app, certain kinds of information from your Facebook account. And once you agree, Facebook passes that data from Facebook servers to the developer. So you might give the developer access to your name, a list of the pages that you had liked, and access to your photos, for example. And the important thing to note here is that once the data passed from Facebook servers to the developer, Facebook lost insight into what was being done with the data and lost control over the data. So to prevent abuse of the data once developers had it, Facebook created a set of platform policies, rules essentially, that forbade certain kinds of activity. For example, selling data or passing data to an ad network or a data broker. However, Facebook had very few ways of either discovering abuse once data had been passed, or enforcing on abuse once that was discovered. So in the event that a report was received by Facebook of a data violation, Facebook could do one of four things. So it could simply call up the developer and demand to know what they were doing with the data. It could demand an audit of the developer's application, their data storage. That was a right that was granted to Facebook in these policies, the platform policies. It could ban the developer from, you could delete the app and potentially ban the developer from using Facebook platform or even using other Facebook products like advertising. Or it could sue the developer and pursue that app. But those are the only four things that Facebook could do once it had determined that there had been a breach of those policies. And in terms of the frequency of the use of those four means, I can tell you that in my experience during my 16 months in this role at Facebook, I don't remember a single physical audit of a developer's storage. I don't remember that happening once. There were only a handful of lawsuits and bans. Those are both quite rare. And mostly what I did was call developers and threaten to do other things or imply that, they basically say that they needed to follow the policies. That was frankly the main enforcement mechanism during my time. The other thing to know is that Facebook had relatively little detection of policy violations, and most of the reports that Facebook got about policy violations were either from the press or from other developers who were competitors of a particular company, and they would call or talk to someone at Facebook and say, I think this person is doing X, Y, and Z, and they were doing that, largely for competitive reasons.
What more do you think Facebook could have done at that time to to track what was happening to user data that had been given to developers?
So I think one of the key things to understand is that if you don't have access to the developer's data storage, which you wouldn't have unless you sued them or they granted it to you willingly, then you can't really see what data they have, because what is exposed to the public view is not the data. So I'll give you an example. So if you think about Cambridge Analytica, there was allegedly Facebook data that was passed to Cambridge Analytica. Cambridge Analytica then allegedly used that Facebook data and other data to create user profiles, which included things like estimates of how people would vote on particular issues. So those voter profiles did not include the source data. They were informed by the source data, but they did not include the source data. So even if you had some kind of digital watermark in the data, by the time you get to the next step, you would no longer easily be able to tell where the data had come from. And it gets even more difficult because then those voter profiles are not what is exposed to the public. Those voter profiles were then allegedly used to purchase Facebook and other advertising. So what is visible to the public is an ad with targeting that is also not visible to the public. So you see there are many, many, many steps between the receipt of data and what you can actually see without some legal avenue to get into the source files of a particular developer. So it's very hard, basically. Yeah. And I would argue that the real challenge here is that Facebook was allowing developers to access the data of people who hadn't explicitly authorized that friend permission.
Yeah, exactly. So really, once the data is gone, once the developer has been granted access to the data, the benefit they get from that is theirs forever. Really, there's effectively practically nothing you can do to recover the data, and even if you could, the developer will continue to benefit from having had access to that data.
It's incredibly difficult. I mean, and frankly, even if you do conduct a physical audit, it is very difficult to prove that the developer has not hidden the data on some secret hard drive, in their closet or something.
Yeah.
You're basically reliant on their word.
Yeah.
At some
Did
point.
people raise concerns at the time that Facebook user data wasn't safe if it could be gathered by developers in this way?
Yeah, I mean, I was one of the people raising concerns inside the company, and there was a lot of actually press at the time suggesting that this was not a particularly that this was potentially violating people's privacy and that there were some real concerns here. So it was a known issue. I think what has changed is people now realize how much damage you can do with large amounts of data.
Yeah, exactly.
And so now they're connecting those two dots, and we have to current scandal.
And how did you raise those concerns within the company?
So one of the things I did was I made a map of the various data vulnerabilities of Facebook platform, which was one of the main ways that you could get, really the only way you could get data on Facebook users out of Facebook, other than using ad targeting, which doesn't give you the data per se. And I made a map of all the vulnerabilities. I included lists of bad actors and potential bad actors, which included, foreign state actors, data brokers. And I said, basically, here are some of the things that Facebook is doing, and here are some of the areas that the company is still exposed and user data is still at risk. And so I shared that around with a number of people at the company at the time.
So can you say, are some of the people that you share that with, are they still at the company today? Are there people at the company today that will have been well aware of the concerns you raised?
Yeah, so some of the executives I shared the presentation with are still at the company today.
Are you able to say who?
I'm sorry?
Can you say who?
It was was senior executives in charge of Facebook platform and people in charge of privacy.
Yeah, but you can't name who they were.
I can follow up with you after if that's specific.
Yeah. But do you think, I mean, would Mark Zuckerberg have been aware of the concerns that you and others were raising?
So I don't know that Mark Zuckerberg would have been aware of specifically what I said, but I think it was well understood both internally and externally that there was risk with respect to the way Facebook platform was handling data. There were concerns from the press and from the public.
So
I don't think it was a secret that this was a problem.
Yeah. Although probably Facebook users weren't aware.
So I think the problem is Facebook users may have understood in theory that there were privacy concerns, but they didn't know how much of their data was being sent to developers who had made apps that they had no relationship with.
Yeah.
So keep in mind, in the case of the survey app that Alexander Kogan made, he only got 270,000 people to download his app, but because he had friend permissions, he got Facebook data on, I believe, either 30 or 50 million additional people who were friends of those 270,000.
Yeah.
And if you do the math, the average Facebook user has something like 200 friends, so 270,000 times 200 gets the 50 million.
The map document you described, is that a document that you still have? Is that something you could share with the committee?
No, I do not.
And is that and was in terms of the warnings that were given, was there a sort of written document and presentation that was shown to people, or was it just something that people discussed?
It was a PowerPoint presentation.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Could you also just do? You said that you were involved in a few cases when you were there of action being taken against developers for breaching Facebook's terms for using data. In those cases, were Facebook users notified that their data had been inappropriately accessed and used by and exploited by a developer?
No, not to my knowledge.
No, so there was no policy of informing Facebook users that their data had been breached in some way.
Not to my knowledge. I don't believe that there was a notification.
Yeah. Just finally, for me, before bringing in other members of the committee, you just touched on earlier on the friends permission, and one of the things that concerned us about Alexander Kogan's work was that he was able to access friends' data, not just the people who completed the survey. Could you just explain a little bit more about how that permission worked?
Yeah. So friend permissions were a set of permissions on the platform that were active from 2010 until 2014, when the company turned them off. Although some apps continue to have access to those permissions into 2015. And the best way to describe it is they give the developer the ability to get access to data related to the user's friends. So I'll give you an example. So if person A agrees to use an app that asks for friends permissions, and person A is friends on Facebook with person B, then the app developer gets not only the data that person A agreed to give, but they give they get the data for person B subject to the constraints of the permissions that person A agreed to on behalf of person B. I realize that's complicated, but basically what it means is if I use a Facebook app and I agree to give permission to my friends' data, and if you're all my friends, the developer gets your data as well.
Yeah.
And there's a couple of important constraints to understand. There was language in Facebook's terms, which evidently, I don't remember the specifics, but it definitely described this process, and Facebook has relied on that to say that people have given consent to the terms. And then separately, there were settings that would enable you to turn off the ability of a friend to give data on your behalf, your data on their behalf. Yeah. The problem, the concern I have with both of those is that A, no one reads the terms, and B, the setting was opt-in, meaning you had to know that the setting existed and go to it and change the setting. And so I'm pretty sure that if you talk to virtually all of the 50 million people who were impacted by this Cambridge Analytica issue, I'm quite certain that none or very, very few would have any idea that their data had been shared with Kogan, let alone with Cambridge Analytica.
Yeah. And was this a continuous flow of data? So once you'd completed the survey, you'd given permission for your data to be accessed and that of your friends. That wasn't just the data that was accumulated up to that point, but any future data that was accumulated as well.
So there were different permissions that enabled different access points, and basically for some period of time, I don't remember all the technical specifics here, so I don't want to give an incredibly specific answer, but for some period of time on Facebook platform, you were able to, as a developer, to pull data at multiple times moving forward as well.
Yeah, thank you.
I mean, and that makes sense in the sense that you can imagine if you I don't know if any of you played Farmville or used one of the other Facebook apps that were really popular in 2010, 2011, 2012. They would need to see your friends and see some of your social activity to be able to inform some of the things that were happening in the app. Yeah. So it provided functionality to developers, yeah. But it could also be abused.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to bring in Chris Matheson, who's just sitting off camera to your left.
Thank you, Chair. Sandy, hello. I don't know if it's good morning or good afternoon there, but it's good to speak to you. Can I ask you, in your time there, or to the best of your knowledge, has Facebook ever been hacked successfully?
So I did work on the security team, which was a different team that was focused on technical security. And so I don't think I'm really qualified to answer that question.
Are you aware of any attempted hackings?
Data breaches. I'm not aware of technical data breaches, meaning systems being compromised.
Right. Presumably they have very strong security procedures and protocols and defences against hacking attack. Is that correct?
Sorry, it's a little hard here. I think you said they have strong authority to deal with...
Yeah, I'm guessing they have very strong security provisions in place to prevent hacking.
Oh, yeah. So what I would say is the security team at Facebook is very, very good. And they have very, very good engineers working on technical security, and it's a best-in-class company for technical security. However, the concern I had was that they had built this platform that would allow people to get all of this data on people who hadn't really explicitly authorized it, and it was personally identifiable data. Had your name, and in some cases, and your email address in some cases. In some cases, could include your private messages. I mean, it was really, really personal data. And they just basically allowed that to leave Facebook's servers intentionally, and then there weren't really controls once the data had left to ensure that it was being used in an appropriate way. That was my concern.
Yeah, you've almost anticipated my next question, really, because privacy and security are not the same things, but they have a similar aspect to them. And it seems that what you're telling the committee is that they take security very seriously, but defending their own servers from external encroachment and attack, but that privacy is not given necessarily the same priority, or they don't seem to have an understanding that it has the same priority. Would that be fair? Thanks.
I think that's fair. Yeah, I think that's. If what you're saying is they take the technical security of their systems very seriously, yes, they absolutely do. And then you're also saying, but they don't take ensuring that people's data is protected overall, including outside of their systems, I agree, they do not take that seriously enough.
Okay, thank you.
In my opinion.
Thank you. Julian Knight.
Thank you, Sandy. It's very, very interesting evidence you're giving to date, and I thought it was a very telling point that you made at the end there, that effectively the dichotomy between the approach to preventing hacking, preventing a very technical breach, and their approach in terms of the data and the use of that data effectively when it's acquired by a third party, if you like. Do you think that this very sort of this looseness of personal data, was that almost seen as a unique selling point of Facebook, something that was actually a part of their marketing strategy?
So the way I would characterize it is the unofficial motto of Facebook is move fast and break things. And most of the goals of the company were around growth in the number of people who use the service. At the time of the platform team, it was about growth in apps, growth in developers. It was very focused on either building things very quickly, getting lots of people to use the service, or getting developers to build lots of applications that would, again, get lots of people to use the service. I think it's worth bearing in mind that some of the most popular apps had hundreds of millions of users. So they had huge, huge, huge scale. And I can't remember specific apps, but I believe that some of those apps asked for friend permissions. And so there was a huge amount of data that was being pulled out of Facebook as a result. And it was concerning to me the volume of data that was being pulled as a result of that permission. I'm not sure if I answered your question exactly.
No, I think you've actually answered it, Mary. So it seems to be almost like some sort of, the analogy would be almost like a frontier town in the Wild West, in this idea of build it, knock it down again, build it better, bring in this sort of, this growth, and all focused on that. Would that be a fair analogy for what the way in which Facebook has approached data, that it's approached it like some sort of the Wild West frontier?
So I think its approach to regulating data was the Wild West is an appropriate analogy.
Yeah.
I think that so when you go back to your original question, you said, was it a selling point? I would describe it more as the ability to access a tremendous amount of data was a selling point to developers. And Facebook wanted a lot of developers to build a lot of applications because they would draw more people to use Facebook more and more. And so developers would, for free, build features that Facebook didn't have itself. And the way that they got developers to want to build for Facebook was, number one, they would give the huge audience of Facebook to the developer, so you could get a lot of users very quickly. And number two, you could get a ton of data from Facebook to build your application and understand those users.
Okay. Were developers using this data exclusively to target advertising? Or were there concerns at Facebook at the amounts that some players were actually spending in certain of the apps?
Sorry, could you repeat your question?
Well, basically, I was wondering, were the developers using this data exclusively, do you think, to target advertising?
Sorry, I apologize, the audio is...
Sorry, I had my hand over my mouth. Sorry about that. Sorry. I'm just asking whether or not developers were using effectively were using the data exclusively to target advertising?
So, these are great questions. So, there were a number of rules in the policies that dealt with attempting to prevent developers from using the data for targeting advertising. An ad network could not be a developer. Developers were not allowed to pass data to ad networks. So there were a number of rules that stated quite explicitly that you couldn't use data from Facebook platform for the purpose of targeting ads. However, that said, like I said earlier, there was very little detection or enforcement, and it's very difficult to tell how an ad is being targeted, particularly if data is taken and then joined with other data and manipulated in some way, and then used in some other platform to target ads, it would be without a physical audit, which you would probably need a lawsuit to get. It would be very difficult to understand that that's happening.
Okay, but so my impression is that there may have been effectively a rule that said that this was not to be used in order basically to target advertising. But what you're saying in the reality that was sort of was effectively that was a rule that was never really particularly enforced. Is that right?
I wouldn't say it was never enforced. I don't remember during my tenure a specific instance of it being enforced. It may very well have been enforced either before or after or both the time that I was there. But the company was entirely reliant on the rule, right? There was very little way to tell if someone was in fact taking this data from a Facebook platform and using it for that purpose. They would have to get a report of some kind and then respond to that report.
Okay, my final question to you is, what do you think should, in an ideal world, and bearing in mind the fact that this is a business and that it is trying in order basically to grow and to provide what it believes to be a service that people want in many respects, what do you think that they should have done in order to better safeguard data? What should Facebook have done?
Well, the very first thing that they needed to do, which they finally did in 2014, is turn off friend permission. So you can now no longer get data from someone who hasn't explicitly authorized the application. So that's a good thing. I think that the practices of Facebook in that period, 2010 to 2014, were, in my opinion, far outside the bounds of what should have been allowed. I believe that the company's practices in the Facebook platform specifically have become much better. I can't speak to, since I haven't worked with the company in a number of years, I can't speak to what the issues are now in terms of the structure of the platform. But what I will say is that I was very disappointed to see that they allowed the Cambridge Analytica situation to play out for more than 2 years after they had evidently received the certification from Cambridge Analytica Hogan that the data had been deleted, despite multiple media reports saying that Cambridge Analytica was using Facebook data, that they didn't follow up. That's what really concerns me. So I guess my concern is mostly around the enforcement front and auditing front. If they are allowing data to be passed to third parties, sensitive, personally identifiable data, they must have much stronger enforcement to ensure that developers don't use that data. So I think basically they must be much more proactive about suing developers if they're going to continue to allow this, to happen. And they must be much more proactive about auditing and using procedures to actually go in and check and inspect what developers are doing with that data.
Thank you.
Thank you. Brendan O'Hara, who's just sitting off camera to your right.
Just a couple of questions, going back to something you mentioned earlier on about data brokers. What are data brokers? How do they operate, and what was their relationship with Facebook?
Yeah, great question. So, sorry, go on.
No, that was the first question.
So data brokers are firms that aggregate sets of data and sell that data. And in many cases, they're aggregating personally identifiable information. So it's actually your name, your address, other information about you, the individual. It's very different in the U.S. than Europe. It's a much less regulated industry in the U.S. And I think the second part of your question was, what's their relationship with Facebook?
Yeah.
So Facebook has always tried very hard to prevent its data from ending up in the hands of data brokers, and it has put a number of rules in place to ensure that third-party developers on Facebook platform don't pass the data to data brokers. But again, it's the same problem, which is they're simply reliant on a rule. They're simply reliant on the threat of a potential lawsuit. And I don't think that's sufficient. I think that the real problem is they allow all this data, personally identifiable data, to pass out of their servers into the hands of a very unvetted set of people. Anyone could make a Facebook app. There was no background check to make a Facebook app, and so it is hard to imagine that some of that data did not end up with data brokers.
Yeah, so I'm struggling then to understand why then Facebook would accrue so much, vast amounts of data through developers and then give it to developers, but not have procedures in place to stop it falling into the hands of the very people that they feared most, these data brokers. Is that an unfair assessment, or have I missed something?
I'm sorry, I wasn't able to hear that.
Okay.
Could you say it one more time?
So I'm struggling to understand why Facebook would then allow such vast amounts of data of their own to then be transferred to developers who would then give it access to the data brokers. Is that right?
Well, again, Facebook didn't want the data to go to data brokers, but I think their primary motive was they wanted to motivate a huge ecosystem of apps as quickly as they possibly could. And the fastest way to do that was to allow access to a large amount of data. That was the primary selling point of Facebook. They had the best and the most personal data really of anyone. And so, again, the motto is move fast and break things. And so the goal was to grow the platform as quickly as possible. And so, data was one of the key ways to do that.
But they must have known that personal data would end up in the hands of data brokers if they didn't have these safeguards or these security protections in place.
Yeah, I think they knew. There were people in the company like me who were saying, hey, this data could go to data brokers. I said that multiple times. So I think it was a risk that they were willing to take.
Okay. Another question, something you said earlier on, is about friends' permission. And when they changed friends' permission in 2014, was this done as a crisis of conscience? Was it a moral decision, or was it purely a commercial decision to change the settings on the friends' permission?
So I think the question was about changing permissions.
Yeah, so you said in 2014 that Facebook no longer allowed friends' permission. And I'm asking the reason for the change. Was it a moral decision or a crisis of conscience, or was it a commercial decision?
Yeah, so I wasn't there when that change happened, so I can only speculate. But based on conversations that I had while I was at the company, I think it was actually a number of things. I think the primary motivation was likely that Facebook apps were in the process of moving away from the web to mobile devices, as people moved from the web to mobile devices. And the problem for Facebook was that on the web, they controlled the payment mechanism, and they took 30% of the payments, so it was a real business for Facebook. But on mobile, they didn't control the payment mechanism. They were controlled by Apple and Google, so they couldn't make any money, really. And so suddenly the upside of building this business and letting people build all these apps and taking 30% of payments they were charging went away, and so the upside was much, much, much reduced. And so then the downside of the risk of data exposure wasn't worth the upside. I suspect that, I don't know, but I suspect that was the calculus.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to Cambridge Analytica, if I can. When did Facebook know that data had been passed on to Cambridge Analytica?
I think the question was when did Facebook know? Is that right?
Yes.
So, to my understanding, and again, I was not there when any of this happened, but to my understanding, they knew when there was a Guardian article in December 2015 that described how Cambridge Analytica was using, I believe, Facebook data on the Ted Cruz campaign. And based on what I've read in the press, it sounds like at that point, Facebook reached out to Kogan, who developed the app, and Cambridge Analytica, and demanded that both delete the data. And at some point, they got some kind of a certification saying that the data had been deleted, and both those entities agreed and certified that the data had been deleted. And I believe also at that point, shortly thereafter, they deleted Kogan's app. They took it out of, it was no longer a Facebook app. So they knew in December 2015. The concern that I have, other than the fact that it that long to figure out that this was going on, because they had legal protection, was that then over the next 2.5 years, from December 2015 until last Friday, there were numerous media reports that described how Cambridge Analytica was using Facebook data, huge amounts of Facebook data, to do a variety of things. And Facebook knew that during the time media reports were happening, Facebook knew that they had a conversation with Cambridge Analytica and had demanded that data be deleted. So there was a 2.5-year period when they had an understanding that data had been deleted, but they were hearing in the press that it hadn't been deleted. But as far as anyone can tell, they took no action whatsoever during that 2.5-year period. They didn't sue the developer, to my knowledge. They didn't conduct any kind of an audit. So that to me is a very long period of time to not take any action.
Given that they had lost control of the data, what other remedies were open to them other than asking or insisting that it be deleted? What else could they have reasonably done in that 2.5-year period?
I mean, I think they could have filed a lawsuit to demand that basically to enforce on the fact that these two companies had signed a certification saying they had deleted data, but they had not deleted data. They could have talked to, and again, I'm not a lawyer and I'm certainly not an expert in UK data protection law, but considering that Cambridge Analytica had signed a certification, had received data in violation, signed a certification saying they had deleted the data, and had signed a certification saying that the data had been deleted, presumably they could have involved law enforcement to help them enforce.
And do you think, or do you believe, that Facebook accepted at face value what they had been told by Cambridge Analytica about their data?
Facebook affected, what was the...
Do you think that Facebook accepted what they were told by Cambridge Analytica, that they had deleted their data? Do you think that they went through the 2.5 years believing that it was no longer a problem?
I don't know. I don't know what they knew or didn't know. My perspective is they should have taken action, considering the fact there were multiple, significant press reports about Cambridge Analytics activity during that 2.5 year period.
And in the 2.5 years, are you aware of any attempts by Facebook to inform their users that their data had been compromised?
So I can only speak to the period of time that I was at the company, and again, I don't recall any proactive notification of Facebook users related to passage of data to parties that weren't authorized or use of data that was not authorized. I don't remember any proactive notification. And to my knowledge, I was not working at the company during any of this period, but I don't believe that Facebook notified users about what happened with Cambridge Analytica, and nor have they done so to this, my understanding.
And finally, the Cambridge Analytica incident, do you think it was a data breach on behalf of Facebook, or was it a failure of procedure and a failure of their own rules and their own due diligence?
Yeah, so I can't give a legal opinion on whether it was a data breach. I think from the perspective of a user of Facebook, the effect of this is the same as a data breach. And in fact, I would say that this is in some ways worse than a data breach, because in the event of a data breach, or rather, the users had no idea this had happened. Their data was compromised in the same way as it would have been during a technical data breach. And Facebook was aware this had happened and didn't notify anyone, and then should have been aware that it was continuing to happen, and again, didn't notify anyone, to the best of my knowledge. So I think arguing over whether it's a data breach or not is not really the point. I think the effect of this on users was the same as the data breach, and I would argue it should be treated as such.
Okay, thank you very much.
I mean, Sandy, from what you've said, it would seem clear that whilst we've been focusing this week on the data breach with Cambridge Analytica, there have been probably many such data breaches involving other companies and other developers in the past. Would that be your view?
There were certainly a number of reports of similar kinds of activity, and I think one of the challenges was the company Facebook rarely, in my experience, if ever, investigated to the point where the absolute truth was understood.
For the benefit of the record, could you just cite some of those particular reports that you're referring to?
Yeah, so one example is there was a company called, and again, this is an allegation because Facebook never understood exactly what happened. So it's an allegation. I can't say this was a data breach, I wouldn't characterize this as a breach. But so let me explain what happened in this particular example, and then we can talk about what it means. There was a company called Clout, K-L-O-U-T, that was using, allegedly, third-party permissions, friend permissions, to create profiles, some of which were children. So, basically like, you go to the Clout webpage and you could see a profile of someone with their name and I believe their photo, but that person had not created that profile. And in some cases, those profiles were of children, and those children's profiles were discovered by their parents. Their parents were the ones who had authorized the Clout Facebook app to access Facebook data. And so this caused a report in the New York Times, which raised a fair amount of concern that basically Clout was getting access to the data of children and using that data to create profiles of these children without the children's consent. And so what happened was there was this report in the New York Times that alerted Facebook that this was going on. I called the leadership of Clout and I said, "Are you violating Facebook's policies?" And they said, "No, we are not." And I reiterated what the policies were and said, "You absolutely have to follow these policies." And they said, "Yes, we absolutely will." And that was the end of the call. They stopped doing the ghost profile feature either before or right after that, I'm not sure. But around the time they disabled that feature, they continued to access Facebook data, and they continued to be a Facebook app. So there was no further action taken, to my knowledge, by Facebook as a result of that. So I don't, was there misuse of Facebook platform? There may well have been. However, Facebook did not investigate deeply enough to determine exactly what abuse took place.
And Did you recommend to Facebook that they should investigate? What were you able to suggest should be done after you'd had your call with Clout?
In that specific instance, I don't recall if I made a recommendation about Clout. In general, I asked for deeper audits and more, more audits of developers and a more aggressive enforcement regime.
And what was their response when you asked for that?
Well, essentially, they did not want to do that.
Why? Because why not?
So I didn't get a specific response, but I believe that the company felt that it would be in a worse legal position if it investigated and understood the extent of use than if it did not. That was the impression that I got.
Why? Because people might say Facebook had some liability for allowing this to happen.
I don't remember the specific language that was used, but the impression that I got was if Facebook did an investigation and received information that showed that policies were being broken and potentially laws were being broken, then Facebook was liable. However, if Facebook did not know what was happening, then they could claim that they didn't know and they were simply a platform, and what third parties do on their platform is not something that you could sue Facebook for.
So from what you're saying, it sounds like they turned a blind eye because they didn't want to find out the truth.
That was my impression, yes.
You mentioned as well that there are some Facebook apps that had hundreds of millions of users. So we've focused on Alexander Kogan's surveys, but that is tiny in comparison to the data gathering that other developers are doing.
Yes. Yeah. So I should add, there's one additional concern that may have caused shutdown of friend permissions in 2014, and that is concern. There was concern inside Facebook that other developers were building their own social networks because they had access to so much friend data that they could see most of the social graph of Facebook.
Yeah. So it was done not to protect users, but to protect themselves.
Well, I wasn't there for the decision that was made, so I can't speak to how that decision was arrived at. But I believe it was some combination of risk mitigation because of the user protection issues and business rationale.
Yeah, thank you. Simon Hart.
Thank you very much. You probably read or heard earlier in the week that Facebook gained access to Cambridge Analytica's office, I think on Monday evening, when all of this was beginning to catch fire. Is there any reason why you think that was possible? What was the relationship, in your estimation, between Facebook and Cambridge Analytica which enabled them to gain access, albeit for a short time, rather than Facebook and a whole host of other organisations which may have been equally concerned?
I can't speak to the specifics of the Facebook-Cambridge Analytica relationship. I can say that Facebook has an audit right for its platform policies. So if a company is a developer on Facebook, they agree to Facebook's platform policies, and those policies give Facebook the right to audit the app. And I believe that also gives them the right to audit the data storage of the company. I think the key thing to note here is that, to my knowledge, Cambridge Analytica was not a Facebook developer. I may be wrong, I'm not sure, but in this case, Kogan was the developer. Cambridge Analytica was a fourth party where data was passed from Kogan to Cambridge. So I suspect that what gave them the right or the leverage to go into their office was this legal certification that they signed with, that Cambridge and Facebook signed after it became apparent that they had access to data in violation of the law.
So is that a different thing from suggesting or implying, not you but I am, that there might have been some either historical, commercial, or current commercial relationship between the two companies which facilitated that access? Or do you think it was simply because of the sort of legal arrangements, the contractual arrangements that you referred to?
Well, I can't speak to, I don't know what the commercial relationship was. However, I find it hard to believe that folk didn't know that Cambridge Analytica was working with the Trump campaign. The Trump campaign was spending tens of millions of dollars on Facebook ads.
Did it?
But I can't
No,
speak to
okay.
what the relationship was, but they clearly were involved in large volumes of Facebook advertising.
What was your initial impression when you heard that Facebook were, or agents of Facebook? I think they said they were independent auditors, but they were there under the instructions of Facebook. When you heard that they were knocking on the door of Cambridge Analytica on Monday evening, what was your impression? What was your reaction to that? What did you think was going? What did you think was going on?
First part of that, my impression.
I see. When you first heard, as we were on, that Facebook or auditors appointed by Facebook were knocking on the door of Cambridge Analytica and demanding access, what was your initial impression? What did you think was going on?
I mean, my first impression was this is 2.5 years too late. I mean, why didn't this happen when they learned that this was going on? That was my first impression.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, again, I can't speak to what the relationship was between Cambridge and Facebook and the Trump campaign. I had no detail of that whatsoever. But from the perspective of someone who worked on these issues a few years before this happened, it was shocking to me that they waited this long to take the step that they should have taken all along, which is, if they are the right authority to enforce, to actually go in and enforce.
Can I just go back to a question I think you answered or were answering a little bit earlier on about other organisations? We've dealt extensively with Facebook and Cambridge Analytica and the relationship or otherwise that those two organisations. Just there are, of course, numerous other organisations, often quite small companies, in and around the business of elections and referendums, who also boast that they are able to target and micro-target voter groups to the benefit of whoever is the paying client. I know you started to answer this, but I was just wondering, is there sufficient evidence out there, do you think, to suggest that there are other companies without the brand recognition of Cambridge Analytica who may have acquired, well, presumably have acquired data from somewhere? Do you think they might have acquired data illegally from Facebook and that might have been used in an attempt to impact the outcome on elections in the UK and further afield?
That seems very likely. I mean, the amount of data that was passed out of Facebook platform between 2010 and 2014 is just vast. I mean, there were, to my memory, hundreds of thousands of apps on the platform while I was there. And there were, according to some research in the Atlantic Monthly that was cited over last weekend, something like 11% of Facebook apps from 2011 were using some form of rent permissions. So I don't know if you can extrapolate directly from hundreds of thousands of apps times 11%, but you're likely talking about tens of thousands of apps that got access to friend permissions, and some of those apps had huge, tens or hundreds of millions of users. So there's vast trove of data that has been passed out into the world.
I mean, you may not have been following this as closely perhaps as we have been, but any suggestion that the players in the EU referendum campaign in the UK may have been accessing this data in the manner that you describe?
So I have no information about how that data was used. I always assumed that there was some sort of black market for some of this data that just, Facebook and others couldn't see. But I have no insight into how that black market works or whether it was used in elections generally, or in UK elections specifically. Unfortunately, I can't answer.
But I think I asked the question about it. There are a lot of organisations which are out there constantly trying to persuade us that they have sort of micro-targeting ability, which would help one political party or movement. That's quite a common feature of UK politics these days. Where are they getting their data from, I suppose, is my question.
Well, Facebook's certainly not the only source. I mean, there is a huge market for data, and what was unique about Facebook was the vast scale of Facebook and the volume of very accurate, personally identifiable information. But there are many sources for personally identifiable data on people, and if you have the money to pay, you can start building a fairly comprehensive data set quite quickly. And if you're willing to bend the rules and break the law, you may be able to acquire data from additional sources, one of which might be Facebook.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sure.
Ian Lucas.
Sandy, you just said the Trump campaign was spending tens of millions of pounds on Facebook ads or dollars. Isn't it the case that Facebook itself is making huge amounts of money from political advertising and targeted political advertising? Is that true?
Yes, the tens of millions of dollars, and I don't know the exact numbers,
yeah.
But reported in the high tens of millions of dollars over the course of the 2016 campaign. That money is paid directly to Facebook.
But Facebook also itself markets itself in politics to political parties and political campaigns to micro-target voters. That's true, isn't it?
It is. I mean, one of the key things to remember here is that the intent of Facebook platform was never to target ads. It was explicitly not for that. The problem was there weren't reasonable controls in place to ensure that didn't happen. And so there are multiple ways that you can target advertisements on Facebook. Facebook has very good data that you can use in a compliant way through their ad tools. But what allegedly Cambridge Analytica was doing or trying to do was create external profiles, allegedly using Facebook data and other data of individual voters, and then building custom lists. What's Facebook called custom audiences, where you have specific Facebook users that you want to target, and then you can build these custom lists and target specific ads at subsets of these users that you've created yourself.
But what I don't understand is what the difference is between what Cambridge Analytica was doing and what Facebook does with the data that it has itself. Doesn't Facebook also target individuals for political parties for political advantage?
I think the question is, did Facebook micro-target users?
Yes, in political campaigns. When it sold advertising to political parties and to candidates, wasn't it itself targeting voters and micro-targeting?
Yeah, I mean that's a feature of digital advertising. I mean, what Facebook and Google and other big tech companies sell, their pitch to advertisers, is that you can get very specific audiences.
So they are identifying individuals on the basis of their own records. This is Facebook, and they are targeting advertisements at those individuals for political purposes.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. Yes, I think that is just a standard feature of advertising, and digital advertising just makes the targeting more fine-grained. So rather than you buying an ad on a football match where you can get millions and millions of users, and you don't know who the users are, but you know the people who like football, on digital ad platforms like Facebook, you can buy men between the ages of 24 and 30 who live in specific towns. And if you want to use that to target them with political ads, you can. The platform enables it.
Do you know if Facebook builds political profiles for its own business purposes to target particular groups?
Sorry, I didn't understand the question. I don't know. I don't know the answer. I have seen some pitches that they have made to political campaigns where they tout the benefits of their data for electioneering advertising.
I've had one made to me
Yeah.
before the last general election. So Facebook themselves build political profiles for the purposes of campaign ads.
I can't answer that because I don't know if that is exactly true. But they certainly have their abilities to help election candidates through their tools.
But you also said that you'd heard that yourself, and not just from me.
Sorry,
You said that you had heard that yourself, not just from me, that they had built up profiles.
Yeah. No, I've seen. They have their they've aggressively marketed themselves as having really good data about the. So I believe about the potential voting preferences of users on Facebook. So I guess if you're saying political profiles, if you go into your Facebook ad settings, I believe that you can see how they think that your party preference, at least in the US. I don't know if that exists in the UK, and I'm not sure I would qualify that as a political profile, in the sense that they don't, to my knowledge, they don't break out specific issues.
Can you
Based on what I've seen, which is my own profile, they said you are likely to vote for this party.
Right. Did they get it right for you?
They do.
How did dark ads work on Facebook?
Sorry?
How do dark ads work on Facebook?
Yeah, so dark posts are well, first of all, a post on Facebook is simply when you type in the box at the top of the page of the app and you post and your friends can see it. That's a post. A dark post is a post that doesn't go to your friends or the followers of a particular page. It's a post that's only distributed to users who you target by name. And the main purpose of dark posts is to test many different iterations of ad content. So a political campaign might run tens or hundreds of thousands or even millions of different versions of an ad. And so dark posts are one way to put those advertisements in front of different users by paying and seeing which performs better.
Thank you.
Thank you. Could I just ask one or two further questions on targeting? You said that there are lots of different ways you can target people using the Facebook tools if you're an advertiser. And you said that a company like Cambridge Analytica may be creating external profiles of Facebook users, and then can it target those exact same people through Facebook's targeting tools?
So it is to my understanding, what was alleged of Cambridge Analytica is that they acquired through illicit means a large amount of Facebook platform data, which is a lot of it's the same data as Facebook uses to do ad targeting, but it just pipes out through a different exit, so to speak. And they mixed that with data from other sources, and then they used all of that information to create voting profiles where they estimated how individuals might vote. And then, again, allegedly, they took those pieces of information about individuals and created lists, and those lists were used to target ads by the campaigns, again, allegedly.
So a list of people rather than... So Facebook would... I suppose what I'm getting at is, would Facebook let you target advertising at individual Facebook users rather than just categories of people?
Yes, well, you can, not one person, but you can create a list.
Yeah.
You can say, I want all of these individuals to be targeted, and if there's a match, if Facebook can find that person based on an email address, for example, then they will they'll show that person as well as everyone else on the list the ad that you want.
Yeah. So it's not as simple. So I think in my own constituency area, if I wanted to target, you might think that the way Facebook advertising works is I could target an advert at women aged between 30 and 40 who live in Folkestone, but actually you can do something much more specific than that. I could give Facebook a list of the users, the individual people I wanted to target, and I could just target them.
Yes, you could make a very specific list of, and I don't remember the lower limit. At some point it was no fewer than 20 people.
Yeah.
That may have changed, but you can say, I want to target this number of this list of people and only this list of people, and it will target any of the people that it can find out.
Yeah. Can you target? So I can understand you can target people by things that they like, so I support Manchester United Football Club. If I wanted to target Manchester United fans on Facebook with an advert, presumably I could buy that as an audience. Facebook would help me identify people that had shown that they had an interest in that football club.
Yes, you can through Facebook's advertising tools, you can buy ads targeting people by their interests.
Can you also target people based on language and words that they use in their posts or in their messages on Messenger?
To my knowledge, not specifically, but I wouldn't want to. I don't believe you can say target people who have used this specific phrase. However, interest information might include, related data, data related to things people have said. Although I'm not fully confident in how that works, so I don't want to expand further on that.
So Facebook have, I think just so I'm clear, you said Facebook have data based on things people have said.
Well, yes, if you've written posts on Facebook, which most people on Facebook have, then they have the data of what you said.
Yeah, but and if they've got the data, presumably you can target based on that data.
I'm not confident enough to explain how that works to give an answer here.
Yeah.
So you can't, to my knowledge, you can't explicitly target someone based on something they have explicitly said. You can't do that. However, that data may be being used in a more general way in targeting, but I'm not 100%.
Okay, so hypothetically, if, say in American politics, if someone was writing about Donald Trump a lot, could you target an audience of people that write about Donald Trump a lot?
Sorry, say that one more time.
So just as an example, if someone is posting a lot of, say, favourable comments about Donald Trump, would Facebook effectively have a data set of those people? And in theory, might you be able to target, if you were the Trump campaign, you might say, well, I want to target messages to people that are already well disposed towards the candidate, and therefore, and I can identify that as an audience on Facebook. Yeah,
so I think the best way to describe it is Facebook makes a determination if you are interested in a particular keyword. So Donald Trump might be a keyword. And there is a variety of data that helps them figure out if you were, quote unquote, interested in Donald Trump. And that data may include stuff that you write on Facebook. However, I don't know the technical details enough to speak to how that works.
Yeah, but so what if I was interested in immigration as a political issue? Would Facebook be able to identify people that are interested in immigration?
If that's a keyword, then yes, it likely is.
Yeah.
But I'm not 100% sure.
Because it's quite interesting, because you start to get into potentially quite sensitive, quite hot political topics, and that potentially Facebook creates data groups around people that have an interest in those topics, and advertisers could advertise to those people.
interest-based. So
Yeah.
you can target people based on things that they have expressed some interest in, whether it's liking a page or taking some other action that shows that you are engaged with that particular topic. And then you can also have multiple interests, and so you can target people who are interested in any number of interests.
Yeah, but do they audit those lists of interests? Because someone might have quite unpleasant interests. Someone might be a racist and engage in racist discussions all the time. And would they actually say, well, okay, we'll create a data set around those people, which in theory people could advertise to?
Yeah, so there was a controversy a few months ago where Facebook was determined to be surfacing interest around some very offensive phrases, and those were phrases that those people had used in their Facebook profiles, and so Facebook evidently pulled that information in and surfaced that as a potentially targetable interest.
Yeah.
And after this was called out, Facebook has said they're making some changes. I'm not clear on exactly what the changes are, but they're probably putting some checks in place to ensure that the names of the interests that are used exclude certain categories of hateful things.
Because it's interesting, if you look at, I don't know if you're familiar with an organisation called Britain First, who've recently been banned from Facebook after quite a lengthy campaign where Facebook refused to do that. But from what you're saying, it sounds like an organisation like that, which holds extreme views, could actually not just create a platform for themselves on Facebook, but actually use Facebook to help identify and reach out to people that shared similar opinions to them.
I think that's possible. Yeah, I mean, you can use targeting to find people who are interested in any number of things, and some of those things might be unpleasant.
Yeah, thank you. If I could just bring in, I think Joe Stevens is the next questioner.
Thank you, Chair. We've asked Mark Zuckerberg to come and give evidence to our committee, Sandy. What would you recommend to us that we ask him if he decides to accept our offer?
So I'd love to provide some potential questions for you. I'd love to follow up offline if that's...
Okay, that would be very good. Thank you. Okay, and I also wanted to ask you, what more do you think Facebook could do to prevent interference in foreign interference in elections, both obviously in the US and in the UK and other countries?
So there are people in the group that I work with, the Center for Humane Technology, who are more expert in this subject matter than I, and I think we'd be happy to talk further about that issue if that's something that you guys want to talk to. I don't want to speak to it specifically now, only because I prefer to have someone who's an expert in that specifically give you testimony.
Okay, and just staying on the foreign interference point and what we've been discussing about Cambridge Analytica, do you think that those people whose data has been breached or has been used in a way that it shouldn't have been, do you think they should each be informed that that has happened? And if you think they should be informed, is there a technical way that that can be achieved?
Absolutely. They should absolutely be informed. And I don't see why Facebook would not be able to figure out either who was immediately impacted or a very close estimate of who was impacted. Mm-hmm. Because they have the logs of the app that Kogan made, and they should determine who the friends of the app users are and determine the data that was passed on to users.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Chris Matheson.
Yeah, just a quick one, if I may, please, Sandy. We've had some regulatory action this week from the UK Data Commissioner, but we won't go into the details of that. But what powers have you seen regulators use, and what powers should they have to be able to look freely at the data that is held by big companies? We use the phrase look behind the curtain, to go into companies and see how they are protecting users' data. How do you think that should work, and what experience have you had of seeing it work?
So unfortunately, while I was at Facebook, to my knowledge, there was no physical audit of any developer. So I can't speak to how that works. But I think your question is more about how regulators could audit technology companies. And my perspective on this is that there are a number of privacy issues that need to be thought through to do this correctly. But that said, if you think about how we think about financial regulations and the level of auditing and scrutiny that the finances of companies receive, we should probably be applying that same kind of thinking to some of the non-financial aspects of technology companies to ensure that the information that they're providing is correct, and to ensure that that when issues like this happen, that people are notified appropriately, and that their security mechanisms are reasonable.
So you're suggesting that that puts the onus back on the developers or the platforms to notify the data protection commissioner rather than the data protection regulatory authorities, as opposed to the authorities or the regulator having the ability to go in themselves and carry out audits? Or should it be a bit of both?
Unfortunately, I don't think I'm close enough to UK law to be able to answer that one.
What about in the USA? What's been your experience there? What has been your experience in the USA?
With respect to
the ability of
having protection commissioner in the US.
So there's no there are no regulatory authorities that can go in and check what is happening to personal data held in the United States.
To my knowledge, there's no comprehensive data protection law in the US.
And if that was data held by an American company on servers based in the United States, but was data from somebody from another country, nevertheless that would come under the regime, or as it seems, the non-regime of data protection in the United States, wouldn't it?
I'm sorry, can you read that one more time?
Yeah. If we're talking about personal data that is held by an American company on servers that are based in the United States, but that is personal data about somebody that is in a different country, for example, the UK, then the regime under which that data would be managed would be the data protection regime of the United States.
I don't know the question. Okay. I'm probably not the right person to ask data protection legal questions.
Okay, thanks, Jen.
Thank you. Julie Elliott.
Thank you. And thank you for the evidence you've given this afternoon. You've very clearly explained to us how this all works. Do you think Facebook realises the enormity of the problem it has here?
No, I think if they realized the enormity of the problem, they would have taken some action between December 2015 and last Friday with respect to Cambridge Analytica, and I don't think they would have built their platform the way that they did.
Do you think in the last week it's beginning to dawn on them that they've got an enormous problem?
I believe so, yes. I believe they are now starting to understand how they're going to deal with this.
And what challenges do you think what you've outlined, the way this works, is posing to democracy in your country and in our country? Or do you think it is posing a challenge?
Well, I think it's created huge challenges for democracy, and I think it's not a Facebook-specific problem. I think there's issues with the amount of data that private companies and organizations have about individuals, and the ways that technology is built such that people can be manipulated.
Thank you.
Using that data. I think that's the problem. And Facebook is one part of it, but it's only one part. There's many, many, many aspects.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I think that brings the formal questions to a close. I wonder if I might just ask whether there are any recommendations you might make to the committee about reforms in the way social media works to help further protect the interests of users.
Yeah, so that's because the organization that I work with, the Center for Humane Technology, has a number of thoughts about this, but I'd love to provide that in a more in a written form.
Yeah, great. In that case, on behalf of the committee, thank you very much for your evidence.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Portcullis House, the Grimmond Room. Portcullis House, the Grimmond Room.